All right, so we're diving into this biography all about Osama bin Laden. It looks like it goes way beyond just, the typical headlines. And I'm really kind of curious to see what it reveals about his path, going from this privileged upbringing to becoming, well, Osama bin Laden.
Yeah, it's really a fascinating story. And you know what? It all starts in a place you might not expect. Immense wealth, privilege.
Okay, so paint the picture for me. What was his early life like?
All right, so imagine this. Saudi Arabia, he's one of 52 children.
Wow, 52.
Yeah.
That's a lot of siblings.
In a family deeply connected to the Saudi royal family. His father built a construction empire, the Bin Laden Group, just amassed incredible wealth.
So he was essentially born into like serious luxury. Did anything in his early years kind of hint at the path he'd eventually take?
It's interesting because on the surface, like you said, lavish lifestyle, sprawling mansions, he had the best education. But at the same time, there's this undercurrent of these conservative Islamic traditions, and that's key here. And then when bin Laden is in his late teens, tragedy strikes. His father dies in a helicopter crash.
I can only imagine the impact of losing a parent at that age, especially someone as prominent as his father. Did this event play a role in his transformation?
It's most certainly a turning point. He inherits this massive fortune, but there's also this void left by his father, and it's during his university years that we start to see him really drawn to this radical Islamic ideology, particularly the teachings of Abdullah Azzam, who was really advocating for global jihad at the time.
So we have this young man grappling with his father's legacy, surrounded by wealth, but also being exposed to these, radical ideas. Is it possible that these contrasting forces somehow fueled his turn toward extremism?
It's a really complex interplay of different factors. On the one hand, you have this sense of entitlement of being part of an elite class. But then on the other hand, there's this message of struggle and sacrifice, of fighting for a cause greater than oneself.
It makes you wonder how someone who had it all could be drawn to such a path. What I find intriguing is that he wasn't just a religious zealot, he was also a shrewd businessman. The biography mentions that he joined the family business and actually amassed a personal fortune that exceeded $250 million.
That's right, and his business acumen becomes a central part of his strategy.
Mhm.
He uses his wealth to fund training camps, to supply weapons, and to build this network of influence across the Middle East.
So he's actively cultivating power and influence, using his wealth as a tool to do so. At this point, is he already focused on global jihad, or is that a later development?
That's where the 1979 Soviet invasion of Afghanistan comes in. This becomes a defining moment for bin Laden.
Because he joins the Mujahideen fighting against the Soviets.
Exactly. But he doesn't just join the ranks. He leverages his wealth and his connections to provide really significant logistical support to this resistance. He even co-founds Maktab al-Qidamat, or MAK, with Abdullah Azzam to funnel resources and fighters into Afghanistan.
So he's essentially using his business skills to wage war. What's striking to me is that the Mujahideen, against all odds, they actually defeat the Soviets. I imagine this victory had a really profound impact on bin Laden's worldview.
Absolutely. It solidified his belief in the power of jihad, and it fueled his conviction that even superpowers, they could be defeated. But what's perhaps even more significant is how they won.
What do you mean?
Well, the Mujahideen success, it was partly due to their decentralized guerrilla tactics. They were agile, they were adaptable, and they were able to strike unexpectedly.
Hmm.
And it's this model that bin Laden would later adopt and refine for Al-Qaeda. You could even say that the seeds of his future strategy were sown in the mountains of Afghanistan.
That's a fascinating insight. So the Soviet-Afghan War becomes this crucible where his ideology and tactics, they kind of solidify. And of course, this experience also sets the stage for his growing animosity toward the West.
Yes, this victory, it emboldens him, and he begins to see the West, particularly the United States, as uh, as the next enemy to confront.
Which leads us to the formation of Al-Qaeda in 1988. What was bin Laden's ultimate vision for this organization?
Al-Qaeda, it was conceived as a global jihadist network, bringing together all these militant groups under a unified banner, and their goals were, they were ambitious to say the least.
Yeah.
Expel Western influence from Islamic countries and overthrow any government that they deemed un-Islamic. It was a call for a worldwide revolution.
And in Ayman al-Zawahiri, his deputy, he found a partner who shared this vision and possessed the strategic and ideological skills to help realize it.
Their partnership, it was critical. Al-Zawahiri brought his own network and experience to the table, really expanding Al-Qaeda's reach and operational capabilities.
So they're building this global infrastructure for jihad, with bin Laden as the figurehead and Zawahiri as the strategist. I'm guessing this network becomes instrumental in planning future attacks.
Yes, and as we delve deeper into the next chapter, we'll see how this network facilitates the spread of extremist ideology and lays the groundwork for some of the most devastating attacks in history.
We left off with bin Laden and al-Zawahiri building this global network of jihadists. It's a chilling thought, knowing what's to come. But before we get to that, I'm kind of curious about bin Laden's animosity towards the United States. What were the roots of that hatred?
It's really important to understand that his hatred, it wasn't just, personal, it was deeply ideological. He saw the U.S. as this symbol of Western influence and a threat to Islam. He pointed to the U.S. military presence in Saudi Arabia, especially during the Gulf War, as this desecration of Holy Land.
And of course, there was the U.S. support for Israel, which he viewed as an enemy of Islam.
Exactly, exactly. He framed this Israeli-Palestinian conflict as part of this larger struggle between Islam and the West, and used it to further fuel his anti-American rhetoric. It was this potent mix of religious fervor and political grievance that resonated with many across the Muslim world.
And so he starts targeting the U.S. directly. The biography details a number of attacks throughout the 90s, culminating in the devastating 9/11 attacks.
Yeah, we see this steady escalation of violence. In 1993, there's the bombing of the World Trade Center in New York. Then in 1998, you have this simultaneous attacks on U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. And in 2000, the USS Cole bombing in Yemen.
Each attack more brazen than the last. It's like he was testing the waters, probing for weaknesses.
He was also learning from each attack. He was refining his tactics and building momentum. And, it's a tragic trajectory that ultimately leads to the horrific events of 9/11.
Yeah. The world watched in horror as those towers fell. It was a watershed moment, a real turning point in history. Suddenly, bin Laden was no longer just a name on, intelligence reports. He was the face of global terror.
And the U.S. response was swift and decisive. Within weeks, they invaded Afghanistan, determined to dismantle Al-Qaeda and topple the Taliban regime that had provided them sanctuary.
It was the beginning of the war on terror, a conflict that would really redefine global politics and have far-reaching consequences. But what about bin Laden himself? He managed to evade capture for nearly a decade. How did he do it?
He went into hiding, relying on this clandestine network of loyalists and a deep understanding of the rugged terrain along the Afghan-Pakistan border. He moved constantly between safe houses, communicating through, trusted couriers, really just staying one step ahead of his pursuers.
It's incredible to think he could remain hidden for so long, especially given all the resources that were devoted to finding him. Was it just luck, or was there something more to it?
It was a combination of factors. He was a master of operational security, and he benefited from the support of tribal networks and corrupt officials. But there was also an element of luck, no doubt.
But eventually his luck ran out. The biography recounts the raid on his compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan back in 2011. Can you walk me through that event?
Well, it was a daring operation. It was carried out by U.S. Navy SEALs. They infiltrated the compound under the cover of darkness, taking bin Laden completely by surprise. There was a firefight, and he was ultimately killed. His body was flown out of Pakistan and buried at sea within 24 hours.
A dramatic end to a life that had captivated and horrified the world for so long. But did his death mark the end of Al-Qaeda?
That's where things get complicated. While bin Laden's death, it was a major blow, it didn't eradicate the organization or the ideology that he espoused. In fact, in some ways, his death created this void that allowed for even more extreme groups to emerge.
You're talking about ISIS, right? They seem to come out of nowhere and quickly eclipsed Al-Qaeda in terms of their brutality and their, media savvy.
What's fascinating is that while ISIS drew inspiration from bin Laden, they diverged from Al-Qaeda in some significant ways. They were more focused on territorial control, establishing a so-called caliphate in parts of Iraq and Syria, and they were masters of propaganda, using social media to spread their message of terror and recruit followers worldwide.
It's terrifying to think how they weaponized social media, creating this aura of invincibility and attracting these, disillusioned young people from all corners of the globe. It's like Bin Laden's legacy, even in death, continued to inspire horrific violence.
It underscores a really crucial point. We're not just dealing with individuals, but with an ideology that transcends borders and generations. And defeating this ideology, it requires more than just eliminating its leaders. It demands a deeper understanding of its roots and a multifaceted approach to counter its appeal.
So how do we combat something as insidious as an ideology? What strategies can be effective against a threat that's constantly evolving?
There's no easy answer,
Mhm.
but it starts with addressing the underlying conditions that make these ideologies appealing in the first place. Poverty, inequality, political oppression, these are all breeding grounds for resentment and anger that extremists exploit. We need to create opportunities for education, for economic empowerment, and for political participation, especially for marginalized communities.
So it's about tackling the root causes, not just the symptoms.
Exactly. And it's also about offering alternative narratives that challenge the simplistic worldview of these extremists.
Mhm.
We need to, promote critical thinking, encourage dialogue and understanding between cultures, and amplify the voices of moderation and tolerance.
It's a daunting task, but one that feels increasingly urgent in our interconnected world. I'm also struck by how bin Laden's actions had this profound impact on global politics and security. It seems like the world was irrevocably changed by 9/11.
Yeah, absolutely. His actions forced nations to reevaluate their security protocols,
Mhm.
leading to heightened airport security, increased surveillance, and a more proactive approach to counterterrorism. We also saw the rise of the war on terror with its far-reaching implications for global alliances, military spending, and foreign policy.
It's a complex legacy, one that continues to shape our world in ways we might not always recognize.
And that's precisely what we'll explore in the final part of our deep dive. We'll examine the lasting impact of bin Laden's actions and delve deeper into the complexities of his controversial legacy.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in our deep dive into Osama bin Laden's life, from his early years to the rise and fall of Al-Qaeda and the ripple effects of his actions. But now I'm kind of eager to unpack his lasting impact on global politics and security, especially in light of all that's happened since his death.
It's really hard to overstate how profoundly bin Laden's actions, particularly the 9/11 attacks, reshaped the global landscape. It's not just about the immediate response, like the war on terror and all that, but also these long-term shifts in how we perceive security, how nations interact, and even how we live our daily lives.
Yeah, let's start with security. It's impossible to think about air travel today without thinking about all those intense security checks, which basically became the norm after 9/11. Did bin Laden essentially force the world to just rethink its entire approach to security?
Absolutely. I mean, 9/11, it exposed these vulnerabilities that many countries had, they'd overlooked or just totally underestimated.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just about airport security either. It was about, like you said, this whole new paradigm of thinking about potential threats.
Yeah.
Both from these organized groups like Al-Qaeda, but also from lone wolves, individuals who might be inspired to act on their own. The focus really shifted to preemptive measures, to intelligence gathering and international cooperation.
So a more proactive approach to counterterrorism.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Intelligence agencies all around the world, they had to adapt. They had to start sharing information and resources in ways they really hadn't before. I mean, think about the global manhunt for bin Laden himself.
Yeah.
That was this massive undertaking that involved these unprecedented levels of cooperation across borders.
Right, and this also ties into the war on terror, which was launched in direct response to 9/11. It led to the invasion of Afghanistan and the toppling of the Taliban regime, which was a major geopolitical shift with consequences we're honestly still dealing with today.
The war on terror became like the defining foreign policy framework for many countries, particularly the United States. It had this profound impact on, military spending, the deployment of troops around the world, and the way that nations approached alliances and rivalries.
It also sparked these really heated debates about civil liberties and the balance between security and freedom. We saw the passage of the Patriot Act here in the U.S., which expanded surveillance powers and raised a lot of concerns about government overreach.
And those debates, they continue today, especially as technology advances and the nature of threats continues to evolve, the question of how to balance security with individual rights, it remains like a central challenge in this post-Bin Laden world.
It's also interesting to consider how Bin Laden's actions kind of influence the dynamics between different countries. It seems like they created both points of unity and new tensions.
That's right. On the one hand, this threat of terrorism, it created this sense of shared vulnerability and led to this increased cooperation between some countries. I mean, for example, the U.S. and Russia, despite all their differences, they found some common ground in their desire to combat terrorism. But then on the other hand, the war on terror, it also created these new tensions, especially in the Middle East. The U.S. military presence in the region, as well as its support for certain regimes, it really fueled this anti-American sentiment and contributed to this instability in the region.
Right.
We also saw the rise of sectarian violence in Iraq and the emergence of these new extremist groups like ISIS, who really capitalized on the chaos and resentment that was created by the conflict. It's this complex web of cause and effect, with Bin Laden's actions really acting as a catalyst for many of these developments.
It's a sobering thought, to realize how the actions of just one man could have such far-reaching consequences, even years after his death. His legacy continues to shape global politics in ways we might not always, even recognize.
And that's why it's so crucial to understand not just the events themselves, but also these underlying dynamics and ideologies that are at play. Bin Laden's story, it's this reminder of the enduring power of ideas, both for good and for evil.
It also underscores the need for continued vigilance and critical thinking, especially as we navigate this increasingly complex and interconnected world.
Exactly. We can't afford to be complacent or to underestimate the threat of extremism. Bin Laden, he may be gone, but the ideologies that he represented, they're still out there, and they continue to pose a real challenge to peace and stability.
So as we conclude this deep dive, what are some key takeaways that you would leave our listener with? What lessons can we learn from Bin Laden's life and the events that followed?
I think the most important lesson is that security is not just about military might or intelligence operations. It's also about addressing the root causes of extremism. Poverty, inequality, lack of opportunity. These are the breeding grounds for resentment and anger that extremists exploit.
So it's about fostering a more just and equitable world where people have hope and a stake in the future.
Exactly. And we also need to be mindful of the unintended consequences of our actions. The war on terror, while it was intended to combat extremism, it also created instability and fueled anti-Western sentiment in some parts of the world.
It's a reminder that even with the best intentions, our interventions can have these unforeseen and far-reaching effects.
Absolutely. And finally, I think it's important to remember that ideas matter. Bin Laden's ideology, despite its flaws and its brutality, it resonated with some people because it offered this sense of purpose and belonging, however twisted it might have been. And we need to counter those narratives with positive alternatives that promote tolerance, understanding, and respect for human dignity.
It's a tall order, but it's essential if we want to create a world where Bin Laden's legacy is not one of violence and fear, but rather a cautionary tale that inspires us to build a more peaceful and just future.
Well said. And with that, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive.
Indeed. We've explored a complex and challenging topic, and I hope this conversation is giving you, our listener, a deeper understanding of Osama bin Laden's life, his impact on the world, and the enduring questions that his story raises.
Yeah, thank you for joining us on this journey.
And remember, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.